He pushed the door open with one hand and held the leash with the other, guiding the big German shepherd inside. His wife brushed snow off their 6-year-old's hat while the boy stared at a chocolate donut behind the glass. It should have been just another winter morning in Denver. The manager didn't shout. He glanced at the harness. "Service dog, do not pet," and said, flat and cold, "Get that dog out. We're not a shelter. You people want special treatment. Go somewhere else." The boy's gloved hand tightened. The veteran's jaw clenched. His wife's fingers shook. They didn't argue. They just stepped back into the falling snow. Not because they were wrong, but because a man with a name tag decided their scars and the dog who carried them didn't belong. What he didn't know was that someone filmed everything. And by the next morning, that little corner store had become the center of a storm. Chapter 1. Winter in Denver and the family with the big dog. Winter pressed low over Denver, a gray sky sagging above streets edged in dirty snow and breath that turned to ghosts in the air. The Carter family's old silver SUV coughed once before going quiet at the curb, its hood dusted white like someone had sprinkled powdered sugar over all its dents and scratches. Daniel Carter was the first to step out, boots crunching into the packed slush. At about 40, he carried the kind of strength that didn't come from a gym but from years of hauling gear, sleeping in sand, and pretending fear was just another item on a checklist. He was tall, with broad shoulders that made his navy winter coat hang straight, but his left leg betrayed him with the faintest stiffness, a ghost of a limp left behind by shrapnel and a field medic's quick decision years ago. Dark stubble framed his strong jaw, a few strands of early gray threading through his close-cropped brown hair under a black knit beanie pinned with a small worn U.S. Army veteran badge. His face was rugged, angular, the lines around his eyes carved deeper by nights spent awake more than any birthday, and yet his gaze softened every time it slid sideways toward the back seat. Stepping down after him was Emily Carter, closing the door with a careful, habitual motion, as if she were always making sure nothing slammed too hard around her boys. At 35, she had the kind of slim, wiry frame that came from being in constant motion, hospital shifts, grocery runs, late-night laundry, soothing nightmares. She wore a plum-colored parka cinched at the waist, a cream-knit scarf wrapped snugly around her neck, and her hair, a smooth chestnut brown, was twisted into a practical bun at the nape of her neck. Her skin was fair and lightly freckled across the nose, and her eyes, deep, warm brown, held a softness that never quite erased the sharpness beneath, the focus of a nurse who had seen too many charts with bad news and too many families trying to be brave in fluorescent corridors. Kindness came easily to her, but it was never blind. She watched the world the way a mother wolf might watch the tree line. From the back seat launched a burst of energy in the form of Noah Carter, their 6-year-old son, who tumbled more than climbed out of the SUV, boots landing in a puddle that splashed up his puffy green winter jacket. Noah was small for his age, with a narrow chin and round cheeks that blossomed pink in the cold, making him look like someone had gently tapped color into his skin. His eyes were a bright, curious gray, wide and constantly on the move, like storm clouds trying to decide whether to rain or clear. A navy knit hat with a pom-pom on top sagged slightly to one side, giving him a permanently lopsided, mischievous look. His gloved hands were small, but determined as they fumbled for the most important job he knew he had this morning, holding the leash. At the other end of that leash moved Ranger, a German shepherd whose presence seemed to pull the whole scene into focus. At 5 years old, Ranger had grown into a solid, powerful frame, muscles rippling under his thick black and tan coat with every controlled step. His ears stood tall and alert, swiveling subtly as he scanned the street, and his eyes, deep amber, almost golden, held a calm, assessing intelligence that made him seem older than his years. The black harness strapped across his chest fit snugly, bearing bold white letters that announced his purpose to anyone willing to read: Service dog, do not pet. There were faint, healed scars hidden in the fur beneath the straps, souvenirs from the same war that had rearranged Daniel's left leg in sleep. If Daniel's mind slipped, Ranger felt it. If Daniel's breathing hitched, Ranger shifted closer. He was not a pet, though Noah insisted he was also best friend forever. Ranger was a lifeline with 4 paws and a heartbeat tuned to his handlers. They stood for a moment on the sidewalk in front of the corner convenience store coffee chain, the glass windows fogged at the edges, neon signs humming lazily against displays of snacks and steaming cups. The place was nothing special, one of those stores that looked almost identical in every American city, with bright posters promising cheap coffee and holiday specials taped slightly crooked on the door. To anyone else, it was just a warm stop in the cold. To Daniel, it was a test he was constantly grading in his head: how wide the aisle was, how loud the music was, how many exits he could see at once. He inhaled slowly, tasting the metallic scent of cold air and car exhaust, then the faint promise of coffee drifting out when a bundled-up stranger opened the door to leave. His chest tightened for a heartbeat, an invisible fist squeezing where no one could see. Crowded spaces still did that. Bright lights, sudden sounds, too many bodies moving too close. The back of his neck prickled as his brain whispered useless warnings about ambushes and blind corners that didn't exist in Denver in December. He felt the old familiar tug just outside his awareness, like a hand reaching up from a memory he didn't want to replay. And then, pressing gently against his thigh, Ranger leaned in. It was a small shift of weight, a silent signal. You're here. You're not there. Breathe. Daniel exhaled, long and controlled, and forced his shoulders to loosen by a millimeter. We'll be quick, he told himself more than anyone else, then glanced at Emily. She was watching him, of course. She always was. Not hovering, never pitying, just there. A quiet anchor. Her eyes searched his face for the little tells, the tightness around his mouth, the way his fingers flexed, the set of his jaw. Today, she saw the storm building, but also saw him fighting it back, step by step. She squeezed his arm lightly through the coat, a pressure that said, "You're not alone," in a language they'd built together over years of long nights and hard days. "Hot chocolate," she reminded him with a half smile. "You promised." Noah, oblivious to the wars his parents fought inside their own heads, bounced on his toes, the leash bouncing with him. "Dad, can I pick the donut, please? The one with the red sprinkles, or the blue sprinkles, or both? Ranger likes sprinkles." He stopped to look up at the dog, suddenly serious. "Do you like sprinkles?" Ranger blinked, calm and dignified, then flicked his ears as if to say he would endure whatever his humans decided was necessary to their happiness. For Noah, happiness today was simple: warm cocoa, a donut, and getting to hold the leash like one of those kids in cartoons who went on adventures with brave dogs. He didn't fully understand why Dad sometimes froze in the cereal aisle, or why Mom sometimes looked at him with eyes that were smiling and worried at the same time, but he understood this. When Ranger was there, Dad was better. When Ranger pressed close, the air around them felt safer, thicker somehow, like an invisible wall had gone up to keep the bad stuff out. As they finally moved toward the door, Daniel adjusted his grip on the leash. "Vamos see," drawing Ranger in just a bit closer. Emily reached for the handle, fingers red at the knuckles from the cold, and pulled the glass door open. Warmth rushed out to meet them, carrying the scent of burnt coffee, reheated breakfast sandwiches, and the faint, sugary promise of pastries. The bell above the door chimed a bright, cheerful note that felt almost out of place against the weight Daniel carried in his chest. Noah darted inside first, leaving a trail of melting snow behind him, nose already turned toward the pastry case he knew would be there. Emily followed, unwinding her scarf, her gaze sweeping the store automatically. The clerk behind the counter, the couple at the coffee station, the teen by the fridge doors. Nothing threatening, just people. Ordinary, tired winter people. Last through the door was Daniel, Ranger glued to his left leg, the harness snug under Daniel's fingers. As the warmth swallowed them and the bell chimed again, he allowed himself one small, cautious thought, almost a prayer, almost a bargain with a world that didn't always make room for men like him and dogs like Ranger. Just let this be simple. Let this be one of the good days. Just coffee, cocoa, a donut, and out. He had no way of knowing that this unremarkable corner store, on this gray Denver morning, would be the place where his son learned what unfairness really looked like, and where a single family with a big dog would unknowingly take the first step toward a storm that would shake far more than snow from the sidewalk. Chapter 2. An insult between glass and bells. Inside, the store was warmer than it deserved to be, heat blasting from unseen vents and trapping the smell of burnt coffee, toasted bread, and industrial cleaner beneath low, humming lights. A tinny Christmas song played from speakers hidden in the ceiling, the cheery bells just a little too loud, like someone had turned the volume up to cover the silence of people who had nothing to say to each other. Daniel felt the temperature shift crawl over his skin, a sudden contrast that made his face prickle and his fingers twitch before he forced them still. He guided Ranger to his usual place, just off his left leg, close enough to feel but not so close they'd block the aisle. The dog lowered himself into a neat down without being told, paws stretched forward, head level, amber eyes fixed upward on Daniel's profile. That focus was a tether. If Daniel's breathing changed, if his shoulders tightened, Ranger would know, would press in, would pull him back. Today, the dog's gaze was steady and untroubled, as if promising, "I've got you. Just walk." Emily drifted instinctively toward the shelves near the door, scanning the refrigerated drinks, the small rows of snacks, the display of travel-sized things nobody needed but everyone grabbed when they were tired. She moved with a kind of practiced economy, each stop deliberate. Milk for home, maybe. Granola bar for her shift later. Something small to keep Noah from turning his hot chocolate into a sugar crusade. Her eyes lingered on the prices for a heartbeat. She did silent math the way other people check their phones. Behind the tiredness at the corners of her mouth lived a constant calculation. How far the paycheck would stretch, how much overtime she could manage without falling apart, how to keep Daniel's VA appointments lined up with her own schedule and Noah's school events. She reached for a carton of milk, feeling the cold seep through her glove, and listened. Not to the Christmas melody, but to the familiar soundtrack of her family. The soft scrape of Daniel's boot as he shifted weight off his left leg, the whisper of harness straps as Ranger settled, and Noah's small, bright voice near the pastry case. Noah had plastered himself to the glass, breath fogging a cloud that he wiped away with the sleeve of his green jacket so he could see the donuts properly. His gray eyes darted between a ring of chocolate frosting with red and green sprinkles and a plain glazed one the size of his palm. "Dad," he called, standing on tiptoe, his mittened hand still wrapped around Ranger's leash, which stretched back to the dog like a taut line in a harbor. "Dad, when can I give Ranger a Christmas dog cookie, the one with the little snowman on it? Dogs like Christmas too, right?" The innocence in his voice was almost painful. In his mind, kindness was as simple as sharing treats and making sure your best friend got a taste of whatever made you happy. At the far end of the counter, the store's manager watched all of this with a tightening line around his mouth. His name tag announced him as Bradley Hawkins, but everyone who worked under him just called him Brad, never Mr. Hawkins, because he wasn't the sort of man people instinctively respected, only the kind they tolerated. Brad was in his mid-40s, the kind of stocky that came from years of convenience food, eaten standing up and too many shifts where sitting down felt like an indulgence he hadn't earned. His white dress shirt pulled slightly at the buttons across his stomach, the red tie knotted in a way that suggested he'd yanked it tight in the car and not thought about it since. His hair, once probably a neat brown, was now thinning at the crown, cropped short in an attempt to pretend that was intentional. A shadow of a beard clung to his jawline, not stylish stubble but the tired neglect of a man who always ran out the door half-finished. Deep grooves framed his mouth, not from laughter, but from years of frowning at screens and receipts and schedules that never quite worked out. There had been a divorce 3 years earlier, the kind that ended with custody weekends he half dreaded and half clung to, and since then Brad had embraced a private rule: control what you can. In his store, rules were simple and rigid because the rest of his life wasn't. He noticed the dog first, he always did. It was an automatic mental checklist: hazards, mess, complaints. Then he saw the harness, the bold white letters, and something in him hardened anyway. Service dog or not, animal or not, the sight scraped against that part of him that resented anyone who seemed to get an exception to the rules. Allergies, liability, company policy, phrases he'd heard in corporate emails and mandatory training stacked up in his head, giving him a vocabulary that sounded like concern but felt like armor. He stepped out from behind the counter, smoothing his tie, the heels of his black shoes clicking against the linoleum as he approached. "Excuse me," he said, voice cutting clean through the music and the low murmur of customers. "You can't have that dog in here." Daniel felt the words hit the back of his neck before they reached his ears. He turned slightly, one hand still on the leash, the other unconsciously lowering toward Ranger's shoulder. His first instinct was always to explain, calmly, clearly, the way he'd been taught to deliver bad news without shaking his voice. "He's a service dog," Daniel replied, keeping his tone even. He gestured toward the harness, toward the patch everyone else usually noticed first. "He's medically required. I'm a veteran. The law—" "I don't care what his vest says," Brad interrupted, his volume rising half a notch, enough to gather the attention he wanted. His gaze slid briefly over the small U.S. Army veteran pin on Daniel's beanie, then moved on, as if it were merely decoration. "Customers don't want hair and drool and dander around their food. This is a place of business, not a shelter. If you people want special treatment, you can go somewhere else." You people. The phrase landed like grit between teeth. Emily's hand tightened around the milk carton until the cardboard creaked, and she slowly set it back on the shelf, jaw tightening. A woman by the coffee station, dressed in a navy pea coat with her blonde hair twisted into a messy knot, glanced over, her pale blue eyes flickering uneasily between the manager and the family. Her name was Jenna, a graduate student who spent her mornings hiding behind textbooks and caffeine, and she had the habit of recording random city moments for a small social media account she used like a diary. Her phone, which had been resting on the counter as she stirred sugar into her coffee, now hovered near her hand, her thumb twitching toward the camera app almost by instinct. Noah's head snapped up at the sharper tone. He looked from the manager to his father, then down at Ranger, whose ears were still upright, but whose body had grown even more still. "Mister," Noah piped up, confusion cracking his voice. "Ranger is clean. He takes baths. He helps my dad. He's not—" He hesitated, searching for the right word, the one that had slid out so easily from the adult's mouth. "He's not gross." Brad's gaze dropped to the boy for half a second, but there was no softening there. If anything, the presence of a child made his irritation sharpen. He hadn't planned on an audience that small and that honest. "Kid, this is not about your dog's feelings," Brad snapped. "This is about rules. That animal leaves or you all leave. I'm not arguing this. I'll call the cops if I have to." He flicked his hand toward the door in a dismissive little wave, the same motion he used to shoo away loitering teens and people who came in just to warm up without buying. Emily stepped forward then, placing herself between Brad and Noah, her hand finding her son's shoulder and resting there, firm. Her eyes, usually warm, chilled like water over ice. "You have every right to refuse service," she said, voice low but steady, each word precise, like she was reciting a medication dosage. "But you do not have the right to humiliate my husband in front of our child. That dog kept him alive when bombs didn't. He keeps him present when nightmares try to drag him away. You don't get to reduce that to special treatment." Daniel felt the burn behind his ribs intensify, a mix of anger and shame, and something else he hated even more, the old creeping question of whether he was, in fact, a burden. The past few years had taught him to walk into every public space with a plan, where to stand, how to explain, how to apologize preemptively for things that weren't his fault. But there was no plan for his son's eyes, wide and wet, staring up at him like he'd failed some test that only grown-ups knew about. "Dad," Noah whispered, fingers clenching around the leash until the fabric pressed into his small palm. "Is he saying, 'You're dirty'?" The room seemed to tilt for a second. The Christmas music dimmed to a meaningless jingle. Daniel's throat tightened, words clogging there. Ranger shifted, pressing more firmly against his leg, anchoring him to the tile floor, to the fluorescent lights, to his family, and not the places his mind wanted to run. He could feel every pair of eyes in the store. A man in a construction jacket pretending to study the snack aisle. An elderly woman with soft gray curls and a floral scarf standing frozen near the lottery tickets. The barista behind the counter, a young man with dark hair and acne scars who looked like he wanted to intervene but didn't know how. Brad rolled his eyes, as if all of this were a tedious performance he'd seen one too many times. "I'm not saying anything about you," he lied, the edge in his voice betraying him. "I'm saying no dogs. You don't like it, you can take your sob story and go. I've got a store to run." Something inside Daniel clicked then, not the explosive snap he sometimes feared, the one he imagined ending in broken things and apologies, but a quieter sound, like a lock finally settling into place. He realized, with a kind of hollow clarity, that there was nothing he could say to change this man's mind. He could recite laws, show papers, list diagnoses. It wouldn't matter. Brad had already decided who they were. The only thing Daniel could choose now was what his son saw him do next. He swallowed, forcing his voice to work. "Come on, buddy," he said to Noah, and even to his own ears his tone sounded strangely gentle, as if he were talking over the crack in his own pride. "We're leaving." Noah's eyes filled with tears that he stubbornly tried to blink away as he took a last, lingering look at the hot chocolate machine, at the donut with the red and green sprinkles that had seconds ago been the most important thing in his universe. His small shoulders sagged inside the puffy green jacket as he turned away. Emily stayed close, one hand on his back, the other brushing past Daniel's sleeve in a silent, shared ache. Ranger rose smoothly to his feet, sticking so close to Daniel's leg it was as if they were one unit moving together. They walked toward the door without another word. The bell above it chimed cheerfully when Emily pushed it open, oblivious to the way the air inside had thickened. As the glass swung shut behind them, the store's noise rushed back in to fill the space they left, but the silence they carried with them out onto the snowy sidewalk was heavier than any sound. Near the coffee station, Jenna's fingers moved at last. She unlocked her phone, pulled up the camera, and with a trembling inhale, hit record. She captured the last seconds of the family's retreat, the boy wiping his eyes with his sleeve, the dog's steady gait, the veteran's straight back and stiff shoulders as he stepped into the gray light. Then, with a small flick of her thumb, she reversed the camera just enough to frame Brad's impatient, scowling face and the empty doorway. It wasn't much, a few seconds, a sliver of a story, but she had the unshakable feeling that it needed to exist somewhere outside her own memory. She didn't know it yet, but that quiet decision, made in the space between the chime of a door and the first sip of cooling coffee, had just turned a private humiliation into something much bigger than one man's bad day at work. Chapter 3. Snowfall at Night and a Storm Online. By evening, the city had gone quiet under the weight of fresh snow, the kind that softened the world and made every street lamp glow like a candle behind frosted glass. In the Carters' small rented house on a side street in West Denver, the cold stayed politely outside the windows while a single lamp in the living room soaked the room in warm yellow light. The air smelled of chicken soup and thyme, a simple recipe Emily always reached for on days when the world felt too sharp. Noah sat cross-legged on the worn beige rug, wrapped in a fleece blanket patterned with cartoon rockets. Ranger lay on his side beside him, the harness removed and hanging on a hook by the door, replaced now by only his collar, giving him the rare appearance of off-duty. Without the black straps and bold letters declaring his purpose, he looked almost like any other dog, if you ignored the way his eyes never strayed too far from Daniel. Noah's small hands were buried in the thick fur behind Ranger's ears, gently rubbing and re-rubbing the same spot until the dog's eyelids drooped with contentment. But the boy's voice, when it finally broke the soft clink of spoons in the kitchen, did not match the calmness of his fingers. "Dad," Noah asked, looking up at the couch where his father sat, "do good people get kicked out, like today?" The question was too big for his 6-year-old mouth. It came out in pieces, but the meaning hit the room with unnerving clarity. On the couch, Daniel leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, hands loosely clasped as if he was afraid of what they might do if he let them move. The TV was off, his phone dark beside him. He had spent the last hour staring at nothing in particular, listening to the distant rush of passing cars and the closer sound of his own thoughts looping. What he should have said, what he should have done, what he wished Noah hadn't heard. At his son's question, he lifted his head slowly. His face, rough with evening stubble, held a faint, crooked smile that didn't reach his eyes, a smile that belonged to a man who had practiced looking fine when he wasn't. "Sometimes," Daniel said, the word tasting bitter, "sometimes good people still get treated badly." He wanted to say more, to explain nuance and systems and prejudices in a way that would somehow not stain his son's image of the world, but the words tangled in his throat. From the open doorway to the kitchen, Emily wiped her hands on a dish towel, watching him with that same searching gaze she'd worn in the store earlier. She could hear the effort in his voice, the way he was swallowing not just anger, but the shame that should never have been his in the first place. "Noah," she said gently, stepping into the room, wool socks whispering against the hardwood floor. "Remember what Dad always tells you? Being good doesn't mean everyone will treat you fairly. She sank down onto the arm of the couch, leaning into Daniel's shoulder, making it clear she was speaking to both her boys, big and small. But we still choose to be good. We still choose to be kind. Because if we stop, then the people who were unkind to us already took too much. Noah thought about that, his brow furrowing, lashes casting little shadows on his pink cheeks. So, that man was wrong, he said slowly, testing the idea like a new toy. But we weren't wrong. Emily nodded, reaching out to smooth his hat-flattened hair. Exactly. Daniel watched his wife and son, a strange blend of gratitude and guilt tightening his chest. He hated that his boy's first real lesson in injustice had come so early and so personally. He hated that his own service, something that once defined him with pride, had become part of the reason his family had been humiliated in a place that sold cheap coffee and cheaper kindness. Ranger's tail thumped softly once against the rug, as if sensing the tension easing by a fraction. Across town, in a small apartment that smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink, Jenna sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open, the glow lighting her pale face and highlighting the faint freckles dusting her nose. Her blonde hair, no longer knotted into a hurried bun, fell in loose waves over an oversized gray sweatshirt. She had watched the video she filmed 3 times already, each viewing filling her with the same mix of anger and shame. Anger at the manager's words, shame that she had stayed silent in the moment. Now, at least, she could do something, even if it was small. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she typed a caption for the clip. Veteran with clearly marked service dog thrown out of Denver convenience store in front of his little boy. This is not okay. She hesitated only a second before hitting post. The video went up on her modest social media account, the kind with a few hundred followers. Friends, classmates, a scattering of strangers who liked her city snapshots. She expected a handful of comments, maybe a few angry emojis, and then for it to vanish into the endless scroll like everything else. Instead, within minutes, the view count ticked up faster than she'd ever seen. Notifications began to roll in, first one by one, then in clusters. People tagged friends, relatives, pages that advocated for disability rights, veteran support groups. Someone downloaded the video and reposted it to a larger account dedicated to service dog awareness. Another user, an ex-Marine with a profile picture of himself in dress blues, shared it with the caption, "We didn't come home for this." By midnight, the 30-second clip had been copied onto different platforms, each with its own storm of comments. Some cursed the manager, some shared their own stories of being told no dogs allowed despite harnesses and paperwork. Others focused on the small figure of Noah, his confused face and trembling voice replayed in slow motion with words like heartbreaking and this is someone's kid. A few internet skeptics questioned context, but they were quickly drowned out by people pointing out the visible harness, the calm behavior of the dog, the way the veteran never once raised his voice. The algorithm, indifferent but hungry, saw the engagement and did what it was built to do. It pushed the video further. Back in the Carter house, unaware of the digital wildfire carrying his image across timelines, Daniel tucked Noah into bed, pulling the rocket blanket up to his chin. The small room was lit by a nightlight shaped like a crescent moon, casting gentle shadows over shelves crammed with toy cars and picture books. "Dad," Noah murmured, already half asleep. "Today was bad, right?" Daniel smoothed his hair back, his fingers lingering for a moment longer than usual. "Yeah, buddy," he admitted softly. "Today was bad." He leaned down and kissed his son's forehead. But bad days end. New ones start. It was something a squad leader had once told him in a desert thousands of miles away, on a night when a mission had gone wrong and the sunrise felt like a rumor. He clung to it now with the same desperation. Ranger curled up just outside Noah's door, the way he did every night, taking the first watch in a house that had no guards but still carried ghosts. When the nightmares came for Daniel, they usually came in the early morning hours, between 2 and 4, dragging sand and explosions and loss into his sleep. Tonight, though, fatigue draped itself over him so heavily that even the bad dreams didn't bother to push through. He lay awake for a while beside Emily, staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled hiss of the heater and the occasional car crunching over snow outside. "You did the right thing," Emily whispered into the darkness, her hand finding his. He didn't ask which part she meant. Leaving, not shouting, not crumbling, maybe all of it. It doesn't feel like it, he replied, his voice no more than a breath. She squeezed his fingers. Feeling is slow, she said. Truth is faster. The truth is you protected Noah from seeing you become someone you're not. Eventually, his eyes closed, and sleep took him without a fight. Morning came, wrapped in a bright, cold blue sky, the kind Denver specialized in after a storm. Sunlight bounced off the snowbanks piled along the driveway, forcing Daniel to squint as he opened the front door, Noah's backpack slung over one shoulder and Ranger's harness in his hand. He expected the usual quiet street, a couple of parked cars, neighbors' trash cans, maybe Ms. Alvarez from next door scraping ice off her windshield. Instead, the curb in front of their house was crowded. A line of pickup trucks and older SUVs, dusted with snow and road salt, hugged the sidewalk. Men stood beside them in heavy coats and knit caps, their trees, breath puffing out in clouds as they shifted from foot to foot. Some were broad-shouldered and middle-aged, others wiry and gray, but each wore some small piece of the same story. Unit patches sewn onto jackets, faded ball caps embroidered with names of ships or divisions, medals pinned to lapels that didn't look accustomed to such decoration. Their faces were weathered in different ways, deep crow's feet from desert suns, pale scars disappearing into hairlines, the flat, measuring gaze of people who had learned to scan a room before sitting down. Yet their eyes, when they looked up at Daniel, burned with a shared, steady fire. At the front of the small assembly stood a man with close-cropped silver hair and a posture that even retirement couldn't soften. He wore a dark wool overcoat left half open to reveal a navy blazer beneath, and on that blazer, neatly arranged, shone a row of ribbons and a small, rectangular nameplate that read, Thompson. His face was sharply defined, all straight nose and square jaw with deep lines bracketing his mouth, carved by decades of command decisions and the weight of lives counted in lists. A faint scar traced a pale line from his left temple to just above his ear, partially hidden by his hair. This was Colonel Mark Thompson, United States Army, retired. But nothing about him suggested he had ever truly stopped leading. There was a calm authority in the way he stood, boots planted firmly in the snow, gloved hands clasped loosely behind his back as if he were reviewing troops on a parade ground, rather than standing in front of a modest Denver duplex. As Daniel froze in the doorway, Thompson stepped forward, offering a hand encased in a black leather glove. His eyes, a clear steel blue, held Daniel's with a mix of gravity and warmth. Mr. Carter, he said, his voice deep and unhurried, carrying easily across the winter air. We've seen the video. There was no pity in his tone, only acknowledgement, as if he were stating a fact from a briefing. You are not alone. He glanced briefly at Ranger, now standing alert at Daniel's side, harness dangling from his arm, and gave the dog a small nod of respect usually reserved for men. Then he looked back at Daniel. This morning we're going to get coffee, he continued, a faint iron thread of resolve weaving through his words, at the very place that thought it could shame you out the door. And we're going together. Behind him, the gathered veterans murmured their agreement, a low rumble of voices and shifting boots. A pair of dogs stood among them, one a stocky black lab with graying muzzle and clouded eyes, another a lean Belgian Malinois whose every muscle vibrated with ready energy, both wearing older, faded service harnesses. Noah, who had slipped up beside Emily in the hallway, peered around his mother's hip, eyes wide as saucers. The scene outside looked to his 6-year-old mind like something out of a movie, an army, made of dads and grandpas and big dogs all here, somehow, for his family. He tightened his grip on Ranger's fur and whispered, barely able to contain the thrill in his voice. Buddy, we've got backup today. Ranger's ears pricked forward, eyes flicking between the faces outside and the man at his side. He didn't understand viral videos or hashtags or the way one small decision could ripple through thousands of strangers' screens overnight, but he understood formation, and he understood that whatever they were about to step into, his human wasn't walking into it alone. Chapter 4. Facing the store, hearing the apology, and a bigger idea. By the time they reached the corner where the convenience store sat, the place looked smaller than Daniel remembered, as if the cold and the crowd had pressed in on it from all sides. It was a Saturday morning, but not the sleepy sort. The parking lot was jammed with trucks and cars, exhaust puffing into the air as their engines idled. A loose formation of veterans stretched from the glass door all the way to the sidewalk, boots grinding snow into a hard, glittering crust. Dark winter coats bore patches and pins, 101st Airborne, 4th Infantry, Marine Corps emblems, Navy ships stitched in gold thread, little stitched biographies announcing where each man or woman had left a piece of themselves. Some leaned subtly on canes, wood polished by years of use. Others walked with the careful rhythm of old injuries. A few had children beside them in bright snowsuits, tiny gloved hands wrapped around coffee cups from somewhere else, faces upturned in curiosity. Among them moved dogs, the black lab with the graying muzzle, the sharp-edged Malinois, a caramel-colored retriever with a scar over one eye, all in harnesses, all calm, all carrying their own quiet histories. The line didn't shout or chant. People talked low, greeting each other with nods and one-armed hugs, the way soldiers do when words are still catching up to emotion. Daniel stood slightly back at first, Noah's small hand tucked into his own, Emily on his other side, Ranger pressed against his left leg like a shadow made solid. He could feel his heart trying to climb into his throat as he took in the sight. This wasn't an internet comment section or a shared post. This was flesh and bone and breath and choice. These people had driven across town, maybe across counties, because of 30 seconds of humiliation in a store that smelled like burnt coffee. "I didn't ask for this," he murmured under his breath, half to Emily, half to himself. The weight of being seen like this, not as an invisible burden but as a rallying point, felt almost as heavy as any rucksack he'd ever worn. Emily glanced up at him, her cheeks pink from the cold, eyes bright with a mix of pride and protective fear. "You didn't have to," she answered softly. "Sometimes the right kind of people just show up." Noah craned his neck to stare at the veterans, the ribbons, the dogs, his gray eyes wide, his breath puffing little clouds that vanished as fast as they came. "Dad," he whispered, leaning closer, "they look like a superhero team, but like the winter version." Daniel huffed a quick, almost surprised laugh, the sound loosening something tight inside his chest. "Yeah," he said, squeezing his son's hand. "Yeah, they kinda do." At the head of the group, Colonel Mark Thompson stepped forward, cutting through the mass of coats and hats with that unforced authority that made people instinctively step aside. He wore the same wool overcoat and blazer as that morning, his silver hair catching the pale light, his clean-shaven jaw set in a line of calm determination. Beside him stood a woman in a charcoal peacoat and dark jeans, holding a microphone with a small station logo on it, her other hand wrapped around a notepad. She was in her mid-30s, with deep brown skin and tightly coiled black hair pulled back into a low bun, gold hoop earrings peeking from beneath a navy knit hat. Her name was Carla Ruiz, a local TV reporter known for chasing community stories with the same seriousness other journalists reserved for politics. Her dark eyes missed little. They flicked between the veterans, the store, the family at the edge of the lot, taking everything in. A cameraman hovered near her, a lanky man with a patchy beard and a beanie pulled low, resting the camera on his shoulder like it was part of his body. Behind them, a few other people held up phones, ready to capture whatever happened next. "Mr. Carter," Thompson called, his voice carrying easily over the murmurs. The line parted as he walked toward Daniel, snow crunching crisply under polished black boots. When he stopped in front of the family, he inclined his head the slightest bit, an almost salute that didn't need a brim to touch. "Morning," he said. "You ready?" Daniel swallowed, his mouth suddenly dry, and nodded. "As I'll ever be." Thompson's gaze softened by a hair. "You're not here to make a scene," he reminded him quietly. "You're here to stand in the place where you were wronged and know you didn't deserve it. That's all." He turned, raising his voice just enough for those nearest to hear. "Let's go get that coffee." When the first few veterans reached the door and pulled it open, the cheerful bell jingled like any other day. But inside, the air turned heavy. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. A woman sprinkling sugar into her cup froze with the packet still hovering. The teenage cashier, a skinny boy with a mop of curly dark hair and acne blooming along his jawline, blinked hard, his brown eyes ricocheting between the uniforms and the harnesses. His name tag read, Kyle, and right now he looked very much like a kid who had taken a shift expecting boredom and found himself dropped into a lesson on power he hadn't signed up for. Behind the counter, Brad Hawkins stood stiffly, the red tie still knotted around his throat like a leash he'd put on himself. He was paler than he'd been the day before, the skin around his eyes slightly bruised with lack of sleep. His jaw shadowed with a darker, rougher stubble, as if shaving had felt pointless that morning. When he saw Daniel step through the door, flanked by Emily and Noah and backed by a wall of veterans and dogs, his face went from startled to sallow. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then settled into a defensive scowl like someone bracing for impact. Before he could speak, another figure emerged from the back office, a man in a tailored black overcoat over a crisp blue dress shirt, the kind of outfit that belonged more at a corporate meeting than in a corner store. He was in his early 50s, salt and pepper hair styled neatly, a clean-shaven face with fine lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often, or at least knew how to fake it convincingly. His build was lean but not delicate. There was a certain tension in the way he held his shoulders, like someone used to carrying expectations heavier than his frame. Thin, rectangular glasses sat on his nose, and when he swept his gaze over the crowd, it was with a practiced mix of concern and calculation. His name tag was different, sleek, metallic, engraved rather than printed. Paul Hendricks, Regional Director. "Good morning," Paul began, projecting his voice in a way that filled the space without quite overpowering it. "My name is Paul Hendricks. I represent the corporate office for this brand." He glanced briefly at the camera, then at Daniel, and seemed to make a choice to address the man rather than the lens. "Mr. Carter, we saw what happened here yesterday. We saw it because people cared enough to share it, and because someone in this store—" He flicked his eyes toward Jenna, who stood near the coffee station, cheeks flushed but chin lifted. "Decided it wasn't something that should stay hidden." Daniel followed his gaze, recognizing her from the day before. She gave a tiny, nervous nod. Paul drew in a breath, his expression sobering. "There is no excuse for the way you and your family were treated. None. Company policy recognizes and supports the rights of service dog handlers. The behavior you experienced here was not acceptable, not as an employee, not as a human being. On behalf of our company, I want to say, I am sorry. Publicly." He paused, letting the words hang there, tangible as steam rising from the coffee pots. Behind him, Brad shifted, color rising in his face, a mottled red that suggested anger, embarrassment, or both. "We are implementing immediate retraining across our stores in this region," Paul continued, slipping back into the measured cadence of a man who had practiced statements on the drive over. "Specifically focused on disability rights, veteran support, and service animal protocol. We also want to offer your family complimentary beverages and vouchers as a gesture of good faith and an invitation to—" "No." Daniel's voice cut through politely but firmly. It surprised even him how steady it sounded. Every eye in the store turned his way. He stood straight, shoulders squared, but there was no aggression in his posture, only a weary kind of clarity. He glanced at Emily, at Noah, at the veterans behind him who had come all this way, then back at Paul. "We don't need free coffee," he said. "We're not here for that." He nodded toward the line of coats and harnesses behind him. "People like me, like them, we're not asking to be rewarded. We're asking not to be treated like a problem to be managed." Noah's hand tightened around his, and Daniel gave a short, humorless exhale. "You can train your staff, and that's good. But what I want, what my son deserves, is to walk into a place like this and not feel like the world sees us as extra work." For a moment, the only sound was the faint hiss of the coffee machine and the scratch of the cameraman shifting his weight. Paul's jaw flexed once, the practiced mask slipping to reveal something more tired, more human beneath. He nodded slowly. "You're right," he said quietly, and in that instant, it sounded like the first truly unscripted thing he'd said all morning. Emily, who had stayed half a step behind Daniel, feeling the swell and ebb of his control like waves through his arm, suddenly spoke up. Her cheeks were still pink, but her eyes were sharp, clear. "If people watched that video and felt sick about it," she said, her voice carrying more than she expected, "then maybe we can do something with that feeling, something better than coupons." She turned slightly to include Thompson and the veterans at her back. "What if we had a space in this city where families like ours could come without wondering if their dogs will get them thrown out? A place where vets can sit with their kids, with their nightmares, and not be treated like they're in the way." She looked back at Paul, then at Carla's camera, the flush on her face now a blend of nerves and resolve. Not just a one-day event, a corner, a room, something that belongs to them as much as any store belongs to its customers. Thompson's eye lit with a spark that hadn't been there a moment ago. He tilted his head, already weighing logistics in his mind, as if she had just pitched a mission instead of a dream. A veterans community corner, he mused aloud, with room for kids and dogs. Noah, who had been following the grown-up words with only half comprehension, seized on the part that mattered most to him. "We can make a place," he blurted out, loud enough that a few people near the door jumped. His small face was fierce under his navy hat. "A place where if anyone is mean to Ranger, my mom will deal with them." A ripple of laughter broke through the store, warm and sudden, washing over the tension like a wave over cracked ice. Even the tired kid at the register smiled, shoulders unhunching. Emily groaned softly, pressing a hand to her forehead in mock despair, but she was laughing too. "He's not wrong," muttered one grizzled veteran in a faded Marine hoodie, and that set off another round of chuckles. The sound didn't fix anything, not policies, not prejudice, not the quiet ache Daniel still carried from yesterday, but it did something gentler. It reminded everyone in that too-bright store that this wasn't just a story about outrage. It was also about what might be built on the other side of it. As the laughter faded into low conversation and the camera lights dimmed, the idea Emily had thrown into the air, half hope, half challenge, hung there, refusing to disappear. Chapter 5, Ranger's Corner. Where winter learns to feel warm. By late winter, the snow in Denver had changed from a surprise to a habit. But on one block of an otherwise ordinary neighborhood, something new had settled in alongside the drifts. The storefront used to be a dry cleaner with flickering lights and a perpetually crooked open sign. Now a simple wooden board hung above the door, stained a warm honey color and hand-lettered in deep brown. Ranger's Corner. The glass pane beneath it wore a decal of a German shepherd in a red scarf, head lifted, ears forward, as if he were listening for someone he'd been expecting all along. Underneath, in smaller script, it said, "A place for veterans, families, and their four-legged guardians." On some days, people slowed down just to read it twice, like the words were heavier than the paint they were made of. Inside, the first thing visitors noticed wasn't any one object, but the way the room felt, like stepping into a memory of safety they hadn't realized they'd lost. The walls were painted a soft, warm gray, the color of clouds just before they decide to rain. And along one long wall ran a mosaic of frames, photos of uniforms and plain clothes, of men and women with arms around spouses, kids perched on shoulders, dogs sprawled at their feet. Some were formal portraits, others blurry snapshots, but together they formed a kind of living patchwork. Emily had insisted that every regular who wanted to could put something up there, no matter how unimportant they thought their story was. It meant that a Marine who'd once felt like a ghost could come in and spot himself laughing at a picnic months later, or that a widow could rest her fingers on the glass covering her husband's smile and feel less alone for a moment. Near the entrance stood a repurposed corkboard, the cheap brown surface now crowded with handwritten index cards and sticky notes. At the top, in Emily's neat block letters, it read, "Who needs a listener? Who needs a ride? Who needs help with a dog sitter?" The messages ranged from practical, "Ride needed to VA on Thursdays" in shaky blue ink, to quietly vulnerable, "Looking for someone to grab coffee on nights when it's hard to sleep." Beside each, pinned with colorful thumbtacks, were responses layered over time. Some had numbers and first names. Others just said, "I've been there, we can talk," followed by a simple smiley face. In the back corner, under a string of warm fairy lights that Noah had insisted they put up because heroes like stars, was the kids' zone. A low table was crowded with coloring books, crayons worn down to stubs, and plastic bins of mismatched blocks that still managed to form pretty impressive castles. The rug there was thick and soft, patterned with cartoon mountains and trails. It was rare to find it without at least one child sprawled on their stomach, legs kicking in the air, drawing, something that made sense only to them. Often, a dog would be stationed nearby, head between paws, eyes half closed but ears tilted toward the chaos, serving as both pillow and guardian. Daniel moved through this space like a man walking inside a dream he hadn't known he'd had. He wore simple clothes, a soft flannel shirt, jeans, boots worn at the heels. But something in the way he held himself had changed since that morning in the store. The tension hadn't disappeared. Some injuries never did, but it had learned new places to rest. When he stood at the front of the room during their weekly story circle, there was still a flicker of nerves in the way his fingers tapped against his mug, but his voice no longer trembled on the first word. "We're not here to fix anyone," he would say, the phrase now familiar. "We're just here to sit in the same room with our own mess and each other's." He told small stories about ridiculous bureaucracy, about a sandstorm that left everyone eating grit for a week, about the way a particular song could drop him into a memory without warning. In return, people offered their own pieces, sometimes with a laugh, sometimes with a silence that said more than the words. Emily rarely sat during those circles. She hovered along the edges, refilling mugs, setting down plates of simple food. Cookies someone's granddaughter had baked, soup from a crock-pot that had seen better days, sliced fruit kept alive with lemon juice. Her eyes always moved, pausing on the man whose leg bounced too fast, on the woman whose stare had gone too far inward, on the teenager who had started showing up with his veteran dad, but whose own shoulders sagged under a different kind of weight. She didn't force conversations. She simply appeared with a cup of tea or a gently absurd question. On a scale from 1 to stepped on a Lego, how bad is this week? Until the first crack in their armor appeared. Years of nursing had taught her that some wounds needed stitches and some just needed a clean hand and time. Here, she offered both patience and clean chairs, and somehow that was enough to start. Noah, who now claimed to be almost 7, as if the almost added inches to his height, darted through it all like a small comet with a very serious mission. He had grown a little taller, lost a fraction of baby roundness in his face, but his gray eyes were still an open book. He was the unofficial inspector of fairness, the one who would pipe up with inconvenient questions like, "If grown-ups say it's okay to cry, how come they always say, 'I'm fine,' when they're not?" And then stare at a circle of hardened soldiers until someone cracked a grin and admitted he had a point. In the kids' corner, he could be found patiently explaining to a new friend that some dogs wore work clothes and couldn't be climbed on, or quietly teaching a younger child how to rest a hand on a dog's back. When the room felt too loud, and Ranger, wearing his harness once more, the black strap snug around his chest, service dog, do not pet clear in white, held his usual position near the door. He lay there like a sentinel, front paws crossed, head up, ears attuned to the sounds of footsteps on the sidewalk. Every time someone new entered, his tail gave a slow, measured wag, and his eyes ran a quick inventory. Limp, hesitation, shoulders hunched, eyes too bright or too dull. He didn't judge, he simply noted, and when they moved past him into the room, he shifted just enough to brush a knee or a hand, a quiet welcome in the language of touch. For regulars, that tiny contact had become a ritual. Some would give his head a respectful nod as if greeting another staff member. Others would murmur, "Hey, Ranger, watch my back," half joking, half not. One afternoon, as snow feathered down outside in lazy flakes, the door opened to reveal a woman bundled in a navy parka, her dark hair tucked under a knitted hat, cheeks chapped by wind. Her eyes, hazel ringed with tired circles, flicked around the room with wary curiosity. Gripping her hand was a boy about Noah's age, small and thin in a too big gray coat, his brown hair sticking up in nervous tufts. His sneakers were dusted with salt, and he clutched a fraying blue leash with no dog attached. The animal, it seemed, existed only in his memory. The boy froze when he saw Ranger, his body going still in that way children do when they're not sure if they've just spotted a dream or a threat. "Mom," he whispered, tugging on her sleeve, Do they kick dogs out here?" His voice was small and roughened at the edges, like someone who'd already been told no too many times. Noah, who had been at the kids' table attempting to draw a dragon that suspiciously resembled Ranger with bat wings, looked up and heard the question. He hopped off his chair, marched over with all the gravity a nearly 7-year-old could muster, and planted himself between Ranger and the newcomers. "Nope," he declared, shaking his head so vigorously his hat slid sideways. "Here, if anybody tries to kick a dog out, the whole place kicks them out, especially my mom." There was a heartbeat of silence as the words sank in, then laughter rippled through the room. Soft, warm, not at anyone's expense, but as a shared release. The woman in the navy parka let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her shoulders dropped a fraction, and the corners of her mouth twitched upward. The boy's grip on the invisible leash loosened as he took a tentative step forward, eyes now fixed on Ranger's calm face rather than the doorway. In that bubble of sound, scented with hot cocoa and coffee and wet wool, Daniel looked up from where he was arranging chairs for the evening circle. He caught Emily's eye across the room. She stood by the corkboard, one hand resting on a cluster of notes, her fingers stilling as she returned his gaze. Noah had flung himself down beside Ranger now, wrapping his arms around the dog's neck, and Ranger accepted the affection with regal patience, blinking slow and steady. A memory flashed in Daniel's mind, the fluorescent glare of the convenience store, Brad's flat voice, Noah's trembling question about whether his father was dirty. The old hurt was still there, a bruise under the skin of his life. But layered over it now was this moment. A room full of people laughing together, a frightened child being reassured by another child, a dog who had once been a source of conflict now serving as the emblem on the door. He realized with a clarity that surprised him that the day in the store hadn't just been the worst morning his family had endured in years. It had been a threshold. It had shoved them out of a narrow space where they were always apologizing for existing and into something wider, messier, louder, but filled with hands ready to catch them. Here, in this small corner of Denver with its wall of photos and its handwritten notes and its dogs asleep under tables, Daniel could finally imagine a tiny patch of the world where dignity and kindness didn't need permission slips. In the end, Ranger's Corner isn't just a little shop in Denver. It's a quiet reminder that God's miracles don't always look like thunder and lightning. Sometimes they look like a service dog lying by a broken man's side. Sometimes they sound like a child asking, "Was my dad wrong?" and waking up a whole community. Sometimes they travel as a short video on a stranger's phone that God uses to gather the right people at the right time in the right place. Most of us won't open a center like Ranger's Corner, but every day we can open a corner in our own hearts, choose to listen instead of judge, to stand up when someone is shamed, to treat every wounded soul, man, woman, or dog, as someone God loves deeply. That, too, is a small miracle. If this story moved you, share it, so more people remember that dignity and kindness are never too much trouble. Comment your own story of a small everyday miracle or a moment you felt God's hand in your life. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories of quiet heroes and faithful companions. And as you finish this video, I pray God blesses you and your family, that He brings comfort to your hidden wounds, strength to your tired days, and a Ranger's Corner of peace and belonging wherever you are.